December 16, 1944, 5:30 hours, the Ardennes Forest. A German column stretches for miles through the frozen Belgian woods. At its head are 117 tanks and 4,800 men under the command of Joachim Paper. This is Kampfgruppe Paper, the spearhead of Adolf Hitler's final gamble in the West, Battle of the Bulge, part of Operation Wacht am Rhein. But Paper is not moving. For 16 hours, the most powerful armored force in the German assault has sat motionless in the December darkness. Not because of American resistance, not because of mechanical failure, the column is trapped behind horse-drawn wagons. Thousands of them. The German army's artillery is still pulled by draft animals that can manage perhaps 30 kilometers on a good day, and this is not a good day. The roads are narrow, the mud is thick, and the horses are exhausted. Paper rages at the delay. Every hour matters. His mission depends on speed and surprise, but there is nothing he can do. The most advanced armored force in the German military must wait for horses. When the tanks finally begin to move, their fuel gauges are already dropping. The entire operation depends on capturing Allied fuel depots. German planners have stockpiled roughly 4.25 million gallons of fuel, enough for only 5 or 6 days of intense operations. After that, the Panzers must run on captured American supplies, or they will stop forever. This was the plan from the beginning. Capture Allied fuel, reach Antwerp, split the Allied armies, and force a negotiated peace. It was a desperate gamble built on the assumption that American logistics would fail. It was the greatest miscalculation of the war. Paper's force passes near Stavelot, just minutes away from a massive fuel depot containing nearly 3 million gallons of gasoline. Enough to change the entire course of the battle. But he does not know it exists. German intelligence has failed. His maps show nothing, his scouts report nothing. While he hesitates at a bridge, unsure if it can support his heavy tanks, American troops evacuate the depot. Hundreds of trucks load fuel through the night. What cannot be moved is destroyed. Over 100,000 gallons are set ablaze, creating a wall of fire that blocks the advance. By December 19th, Paper's attack is finished, not destroyed by enemy fire, but by mathematics. There is simply not enough fuel to continue. His tanks cannot reach the next objective. On Christmas Eve, he orders the vehicles abandoned and destroyed. Crews drain the last fuel, set their machines on fire, and escape on foot. Hundreds of men attempt to break through American lines. Many succeed, but they leave behind the burned-out remains of Germany's last major armored thrust. Across the Ardennes, the same story unfolds. Tanks, half-tracks, and vehicles are abandoned not because they were defeated in battle, but because they ran out of fuel. Some units come within just 3 miles of the Meuse River, their critical objective, before stopping completely. 3 miles might as well have been 300. Engines went silent, and the offensive died where it stood. This is the story of a war decided not just by weapons, but by supply. A war where one side had endless trucks and fuel, and the other had horses and shortages. It is the story of the most important weapon of World War II logistics. There is a famous saying, "Amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics." It is often misattributed to historical figures, but the truth behind it is undeniable. Dwight D. Eisenhower understood this better than anyone. Before leading the largest invasion in history, he studied the movement of supplies, fuel distribution, vehicle maintenance, and the mathematics of war. Battles are not won by tactics alone, but by the ability to sustain armies in the field. The imbalance between the Allied and Axis powers was overwhelming. The Allies controlled access to over 1 billion metric tons of crude oil, while the Axis powers had only a fraction of that. Germany produced less than 5% of the world's oil. This was not a hidden weakness, it was known before the war began. German planners calculated that their military required over 7 million barrels of fuel per month, but production could only meet part of that demand. A permanent shortfall existed from the very beginning. Germany entered the war knowing it did not have enough fuel to sustain it. The plan relied on rapid victories and captured resources. When those assumptions failed, the consequences were inevitable. The image of the German war machine, columns of tanks racing across Europe in a lightning war, is partly illusion. Historian Karl-Heinz Frieser showed that much of this image was propaganda. The reality was far less modern. Throughout the war, Germany relied heavily on horses. Millions were used to pull artillery, transport supplies, and move equipment. At any given time, over 1 million animals were in service. This was not a backup system, it was the backbone of the army. Roughly 3/4 of German transport depended on horses. Only a small percentage of divisions were fully motorized. A typical infantry division in 1944 had thousands of horses and relatively few vehicles. While German tanks were technologically advanced, the system that supplied them moved at the pace of a walking animal. Horses have limits that machines do not. They require food, water, and rest. They cannot operate effectively in extreme conditions. When they break down, they cannot be repaired. They simply die. On the Eastern Front, hundreds of thousands perished from cold, exhaustion, and starvation. When Operation Barbarossa began in 1941, German forces advanced rapidly, but their supply lines stretched thin. Soviet railways used a different gauge, preventing German trains from operating on captured tracks. Everything had to be converted before it could be used. Until then, supplies moved by truck and horse across vast distances. As the army advanced, the strain increased. Vehicles broke down faster than they could be repaired. Fuel consumption rose. Supplies failed to reach the front. Tanks were abandoned not because they were destroyed, but because they could not move. Even as German forces approached Moscow, they lacked the fuel to continue. The offensive stalled, not from lack of courage or skill, but from logistical failure. While Germany struggled, the United States unleashed an unprecedented industrial effort. American factories produced millions of trucks, forming the backbone of Allied logistics. The most famous of these was the GMC CCKW, known as the Deuce and a Half. It was reliable, standardized, and capable of operating in difficult conditions. Hundreds of thousands were built, allowing supplies to move continuously across vast distances. This difference defined the war. One side relied on horses and limited fuel. The other built a system that could deliver supplies anywhere, anytime. In the end, it was not just firepower or tactics that determined victory. It was the ability to keep moving, keep fighting, and never run out. It was available in more than 50 different configurations: cargo hauler, fuel tanker, water carrier, mobile workshop, ambulance, fire truck, communications vehicle. Whatever the army needed, the same chassis could be adapted to the task. The same engine, the same transmission, just different equipment mounted on top. Studebaker produced another 219,882 US-6 trucks, and about 152,000 of these were shipped directly to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease. The Soviets valued them highly for their reliability in extreme cold and their ease of maintenance. They continued operating when captured German vehicles froze solid. The Willis MB and Ford GPW added another 640,000 to 650,000 vehicles. Every part of a Ford was interchangeable with every part of a Willis. Different factories, different branding, identical components. A mechanic in France could strip parts from one and use them on the other without checking specifications. In total, American factories produced over 2.3 million soft-skinned military vehicles. The entire Axis, Germany, Italy, and Japan combined, produced fewer than 50,000. The numerical advantage was overwhelming. But numbers alone do not explain the difference. The real strength of the American system was standardization. The United States organized its production around a few standardized chassis classes, ensuring complete interchangeability of parts. A fuel pump made in one factory would fit perfectly into a vehicle produced in another. Repairs could be done quickly anywhere using whatever parts were available. Germany took the opposite approach, and the consequences were severe. Before the war, the German military already operated over 100 different truck types. Attempts to standardize failed, and as Germany conquered territory, it absorbed vehicles from across Europe: French, Czech, Polish, Dutch, Belgian, British, and Soviet. Each came with different parts, fuel requirements, and maintenance needs. By some estimates, Germany ended up operating around 2,000 different vehicle types. This created a logistical nightmare. A mechanic might face a broken French truck in Russia with no access to replacement parts manufactured thousands of kilometers away. Without parts, vehicles were abandoned. This inefficiency was not just inconvenient, it was strategically devastating. Erwin Rommel understood this better than most. During his North African campaign, he famously noted that battles were decided by logistics before they were ever fought. His Africa Corps required enormous daily supplies, fuel, ammunition, food, water, but the Mediterranean supply line was constantly under attack. British submarines and aircraft sank a significant portion of shipments before they ever reached North Africa. Even when supplies arrived, they had to be transported across vast desert distances. Trucks consumed fuel just to deliver fuel. In some cases, up to half of all delivered gasoline was used simply to move the rest forward. Every advance stretched supply lines further, bringing Rommel closer to collapse. At the First Battle of El Alamein, his forces were already critically low on fuel. By the Second Battle of El Alamein, they had only enough supplies for a few days of sustained combat. Bernard Montgomery knew this and simply waited for German resources to run out. The battle was decided not by tactics, but by supply shortages. The same pattern repeated in Western Europe. During the Normandy breakout, Operation Cobra shattered German defenses with massive aerial bombardment. When German forces attempted a counterattack, they could muster only a limited number of tanks. Many were destroyed, and others ran out of fuel. Within days, the offensive collapsed. The result was the Falaise Pocket, where Allied forces surrounded and destroyed a large portion of the German army in France. Thousands were killed or captured, and hundreds of vehicles were abandoned. German commanders later admitted that more tanks were lost due to lack of fuel than to enemy fire. Meanwhile, the Allies demonstrated what true logistical power looked like. Following D-Day, they landed over 1 million troops, hundreds of thousands of vehicles, and massive quantities of supplies in just weeks. This achievement was made possible by industrial innovations such as the Liberty Ship program. American shipyards, led by industrialists like Henry J. Kaiser, revolutionized shipbuilding by applying assembly line techniques. Ships were built in sections and assembled rapidly. Over 2,700 Liberty ships were constructed during the war, each capable of carrying around 10,000 tons of cargo. At peak production, multiple ships were launched every day. But landing supplies was only the beginning. They had to be transported to the front, which was advancing rapidly across France. By August 1944, Allied forces had liberated Paris, and George S. Patton's army was pushing east faster than supply lines could keep up. Infrastructure was damaged, railways were destroyed, and major ports were still under enemy control. A logistical crisis was looming. To solve this, American planners created one of the most remarkable supply operations of the war, the Red Ball Express. The concept was simple but ambitious. Gather every available truck, establish dedicated routes, and run convoys continuously. Roads were divided into one-way systems for loaded and empty vehicles. Military police controlled intersections to ensure constant movement. Trucks operated day and night, delivering fuel, ammunition, and supplies to the advancing front. This system kept the Allied advance moving when it might otherwise have stalled. It demonstrated the true power of logistics, not just producing resources, but delivering them efficiently where they were needed most. In the end, the war in Europe was not decided solely by battles or weapons. It was decided by the ability to sustain armies in the field. One side mastered this challenge. The other did not. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, 5:30 hours. A German column stretches for miles through the frozen Belgian woods. At its head are 117 tanks and 4,800 men under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Paper. This is Kampfgruppe Paper, the spearhead of Adolf Hitler's final gamble in the West, Operation Wacht am Rhein, the last great offensive of the Third Reich. But Paper is not moving. For 16 hours, the most powerful armored force in the German assault has sat motionless in the December darkness. Not because of American resistance, not because of mechanical failure, The column cannot advance because it is stuck behind. Horse-drawn wagons, thousands of them. The Wehrmacht's artillery batteries are being pulled by draft animals that can manage perhaps 30 kilometers on a good day, and this is not a good day. The roads are narrow, the mud is thick, the horses are exhausted. Paper rages at the delay. Every hour matters. His mission depends on speed and surprise, but there is nothing he can do. The most advanced armored force in the German military must wait for horses. When the tanks finally begin to roll, their fuel gauges are already dropping toward empty. The entire operation depends on capturing Allied fuel depots. German planners have stockpiled roughly 4.25 million gallons for the offensive, enough for perhaps 5 or 6 days of intense combat. After that, the Panzers will need to drink from American supplies or they will stop forever. That was the plan from the beginning. Capture Allied fuel, use it to reach Antwerp, split the Allied armies, and force a negotiated peace. A desperate gamble built on the assumption that American logistics would be vulnerable. It was the greatest miscalculation of the war. So close, so impossibly close. Paper's forces passed through Stavelot, mere minutes from a massive fuel depot containing nearly 3 million gallons of gasoline, close enough to potentially change the entire outcome of the battle. But Paper does not know the depot exists. German intelligence has failed him. His maps show nothing. His scouts report nothing. While he hesitates at a bridge, uncertain whether it can support his heavy tanks, 600 American trucks are evacuating the depot. Soldiers work through the night loading jerrycans and fuel drums. What cannot be moved is set ablaze. 124,000 gallons of burning fuel become an anti-tank barrier, a wall of fire that Paper cannot cross. By December 19th, Paper's advance is finished. Not destroyed by American shells or bazookas, but destroyed by mathematics. He simply does not have enough fuel to cross the next bridge west of Stoumont. His tanks can go no further. On Christmas Eve, he orders every vehicle destroyed. The crews drain the last drops of fuel, set their tanks ablaze, and walk out of the pocket on foot. Approximately 800 men break through American lines in the darkness. About 770 will reach German positions after a grueling march through the snow, leaving behind the steel hulks of Germany's last armored offensive. The panzers that were supposed to reach Antwerp sit abandoned in Belgian forests, their tanks bone dry, their engines cold, their war over. Elsewhere in the Ardennes, the same story repeats across 100 frozen roads. Tank crews walk away from Panthers and Tigers worth more than their weight in gold because those magnificent machines cannot run on willpower alone. Staff cars sit abandoned. Half-tracks freeze in place. The mightiest military force Germany had assembled in years is dying by the roadside, not by American guns, but by empty fuel tanks. Barely 3 miles. That is how close the 2nd Panzer Division gets to the Meuse River before their fuel runs out. Barely 3 miles from the strategic objective that might have split the Allied armies. 3 miles from the bridges that could have changed the course of the war. They stop not because they are beaten in combat, but because their engines will no longer turn. The crews destroy what they can and retreat. Another graveyard of frozen steel. This is the story of how one side had trucks that never stopped rolling and the other had horses and empty fuel tanks. This is the story of the most important weapon of World War II. A weapon that never fired a shot. Logistics. There is a phrase often repeated in military circles. Amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. It is frequently attributed to Napoleon or to General Omar Bradley, but neither man actually said it. The quote belongs to General Robert H. Barrow of the United States Marine Corps, who spoke these words in 1979. But the truth behind them is far older than any general who ever lived. Dwight D. Eisenhower understood this truth better than most of his generation. Before commanding the greatest amphibious invasion in history, he spent years studying the unglamorous problems that win wars. The movement of supplies, the allocation of fuel, the maintenance of vehicles, the mathematics of tonnage, distance, and time. Battles, campaigns, even entire wars are won or lost primarily because of logistics, not tactics or heroic last stands. The side that keeps its tanks fueled and its soldiers fed is the side that wins. In World War II, no nation understood this better than the United States. To grasp the scale of what happened between 1941 and 1945, you must first understand the disparity that existed before the first shot was fired. The Allied nations controlled access to approximately 1.43 billion metric tons of crude oil. The Axis powers had roughly 66 million. That is a ratio of nearly 16 to 1. Germany produced less than 5% of the world's oil. This was not a secret. German planners knew petroleum would be a critical vulnerability. In May 1941, just weeks before Operation Barbarossa, the German High Command conducted a study of fuel requirements. The results were alarming. The German military needed approximately 7.25 million barrels of fuel every month to sustain operations. German production, even at full capacity, could provide only 5.35 million barrels. A permanent deficit of nearly 2 million barrels per month, a 26% shortfall that could never be closed. Germany was planning to fight a world war with a fuel budget that could not sustain it. From the very first day, Germany was fighting a war it could not win. The only question was how long mathematics would take to catch up with reality. The mythology of Blitzkrieg shows endless columns of tanks sweeping across Europe. The reality was horses. Throughout the war, the Wehrmacht used approximately 2.75 million horses and mules. At any given moment, around 1.1 million were in active service. As late as February 1945, over 1.19 million horses remained on the German military roster. This was not a backup system. It was the primary mode of transport for roughly 75% of the German army. In 1943, only 52 of Germany's 322 divisions were motorized or mechanized. Just 16%. The rest moved at the pace of a walking horse. A typical German infantry division in 1944 fielded 4,600 horses, 1,400 horse-drawn vehicles, and only 600 motor vehicles. Their tanks might be advanced, but their logistics moved like an army from the 19th century. Horses have limits. A draft horse can cover about 30 kilometers a day. It requires constant food, water, and rest. Cannot be repaired when it breaks. On the Eastern Front, horses died by the thousands every day. In the winter of 1941 to 42 alone, 179,000 perished. At Stalingrad, tens of thousands more died alongside the men who depended on them. When Operation Barbarossa began, German forces advanced rapidly, but their supply lines stretched dangerously thin. Soviet railways used a wider gauge than European tracks, forcing the Germans to rebuild rail lines as they advanced. Supplies had to move by truck and horse across vast distances. Vehicles broke down faster than they could be repaired. By August 1941, Army Group Center had lost 25% of its trucks. Army Group North had lost 39%. General Heinz Guderian's Panzer Group started with nearly 1,000 tanks. Within 5 weeks, fewer than 300 remained operational. Not destroyed in combat, but lost to mechanical failure and lack of fuel. Tanks sat idle. Artillery units rationed shells. Soldiers went hungry. Moscow was within sight, but without fuel it might as well have been on another continent. While Germany struggled, the United States unleashed an industrial output unlike anything in history. American factories produced approximately 2.4 million military trucks. The backbone of this fleet was the GMC CCKW, the Deuce and a Half, a standardized, reliable, all-purpose vehicle that could be adapted for dozens of roles. Over 500,000 were built. Studebaker produced nearly 220,000 US-6 trucks, many sent to the Soviet Union. Ford and Willis produced around 650,000 Jeeps with fully interchangeable parts. In total, the United States produced over 2.3 million soft-skin vehicles. The entire Axis combined produced fewer than 50,000, a ratio of nearly 6 to 1. But numbers alone were not the key. The real advantage was standardization. American vehicles were designed so parts were interchangeable across manufacturers. A broken component could be replaced instantly using parts from another vehicle. Germany, by contrast, operated thousands of different vehicle types, many captured from occupied countries, each requiring unique parts and maintenance. This logistical chaos crippled the German war effort. In North Africa, Erwin Rommel understood the problem clearly. A shortage of fuel, he wrote, was enough to bring any offensive to a halt. His forces often consumed half their fuel simply transporting the rest to the front. Every advance made the situation worse. At El Alamein he had tanks, but not enough fuel to use them. Meanwhile, the United States solved logistics on a continental scale. After D-Day, millions of tons of supplies had to move from the beaches to the front. The solution was the Red Ball Express, a massive trucking operation running non-stop for 82 days. Thousands of trucks delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies, driven largely by African-American soldiers who worked exhausting shifts under extreme conditions. Fuel, ammunition, food, everything flowed forward. The trucks never stopped. At the same time, Allied bombing campaigns targeted German fuel production. Synthetic fuel plants were destroyed. Romanian oil fields were lost. By 1945, German fuel production had nearly collapsed. Tanks could not move. Aircraft could not fly. The war machine ground to a halt. In the end, World War II was not decided by the most advanced tank or the most powerful weapon. It was decided by logistics, by trucks, fuel, and supply chains, by the ability to move and sustain armies across vast distances. The German Panzers that stopped 3 miles from the Meuse River stand as a symbol of what might have been. So close to changing history, so close to splitting the Allied armies. They stopped not because they were defeated in battle, but because they ran out of fuel. And somewhere behind American lines, another convoy of trucks was already moving forward, carrying everything needed to win a war. The trucks never stopped. They never had to.